The rain came down in sheets, hammering the mud at the Sterling Realty West Side construction site in Chicago. Each drop struck the earth with the force of a small stone, churning the ground into a lake of cold slurry that reflected the gray, bruised sky above. The air was thick with the metallic tang of wet steel and the raw, primordial smell of disturbed soil. Ethan Sterling was pinned face down in the sludge by two security guards, their knees grinding into his spine and shoulders, their full weight pressing him deeper into the freezing muck. His cheek ground against the coarse gravel embedded in the slush, the icy cold seeping through his skin and into his bones, while the stench of wet earth and diesel fuel flooded his lungs with every ragged breath. His cousin Caleb Sterling's polished Oxford crushed the back of his hand, the fine Italian leather biting into his flesh. Ethan felt the individual knuckles crack under the sole, first a sharp pop, then a grinding sensation that sent waves of nausea rolling through his stomach. The pain was exquisite and white-hot, a supernova erupting at the junction of bone and cartilage, but he refused to cry out. He refused to give them that satisfaction. The patent certificate for the lithium manganese iron phosphate battery. 3 years of his life, thousands of hours of research, countless sleepless nights. The sum total of his intellectual genius poured onto pages of formulas and diagrams, was torn to shreds in Caleb's grip. The crisp, official document, bearing the seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office, was reduced to confetti in those manicured fingers. Each methodical tear was a dagger driven into Ethan's heart. The scraps rained down upon him, white fragments plastering into the mud before his eyes, some floating on the surface of the puddles like tiny, defeated ships, others sinking immediately into the brown morass, like the remnants of a shattered dream, the ashes of a life's work, the funeral pyre of a future he had once believed was his destiny. Thief! Caleb spat the word with naked malice, his voice dripping with a contempt so profound it seemed to curdle the very air around them. The single syllable hung in the rain-charged atmosphere, more damning than any sermon, more final than any verdict. Then, as if to punctuate the accusation, he lifted his foot from Ethan's ruined hand and drove it down once more, grinding the broken bones against the gravel for one excruciating second before stepping back with the casual indifference of someone scraping dog excrement from his shoe. Their grandfather, Harrison Sterling, stood a few yards away beneath a vast black umbrella held by a uniformed chauffeur. Rainwater cascaded off the canopy in a perfect curtain, as if even the elements deferred to his authority. His face was a mask of marble, utterly devoid of expression, the same face that had built a real estate empire from nothing, that had crushed competitors without mercy, that had discarded 3 wives when they ceased to be useful. He watched the scene unfold with the detached interest of a monarch observing a public execution. Then, with a movement so slight it might have been imagined, he turned his face aside. That gesture, that small turn of the head, spoke volumes. It was not ignorance. It was not helplessness. It was tacit approval of the frame job, the final nail in the coffin of Ethan's old life. In that single, almost imperceptible motion, a grandfather disowned his grandson, a patriarch sealed a young man's fate, and a dynasty revealed the rot at its core. Ethan didn't know yet that when his father, David Sterling, got word he'd been banished and his patent stolen, when he learned that his own brother and nephew had orchestrated the destruction of his son, the shock triggered a massive heart attack. The news had reached him in his private laboratory, a converted warehouse on the south side where he still conducted the research that had once made Sterling Industries a pioneer. He had clutched his chest, his face turning purple, gasping for air as the phone clattered to the floor. The Sterlings, having anticipated this very outcome, had positioned their people at every juncture. They blocked anyone from calling an ambulance. They held the household staff at bay with threats and promises. They watched, with cold calculation, as David Sterling's life ebbed away on the cold linoleum floor of his laboratory, surrounded by the patents and prototypes that had made his family wealthy. By the time Ethan managed to fight his way through the bureaucratic maze of hospital security and the deliberate obfuscation of the family's legal team, his father was long dead. The body had already been removed. The laboratory had been sealed. All that remained was a chalk outline on the floor, and a grief so vast it threatened to swallow him whole. His mother, Margaret, a gentle woman who had once been the heart of their small family, was broken by the double blow. She had already been fragile. Years of standing beside her husband against the Sterling family's machinations had taken their toll. Now, the loss of her husband and the destruction of her son's reputation shattered something fundamental within her. She collapsed into illness with the suddenness of a building succumbing to demolition charges. What began as exhaustion and grief metastasized into something far more serious. A cascade of organ failures, a collapse of the immune system, a descent into a twilight world of hospital beds and medication schedules. The crushing medical bills pressed down on Ethan like a mountain, each invoice a boulder added to the burden on his shoulders. The family that had once called itself his blood now denied him access to the trust funds his father had established, froze the accounts that should have been his inheritance, and left him with nothing but his mother's illness and a burning, incandescent need for justice. 5 years later, midsummer sun blazed over the West Side site, brutal enough to peel skin from unprotected flesh. The heat rose from the exposed earth in visible waves, distorting the air like a funhouse mirror. The concrete mixers roared loud enough to rattle teeth, their grinding mechanical guts producing a ceaseless bass note that vibrated through the soles of work boots and into the very marrow of the workers. The air was thick with cement dust that coated the tongue and throat with alkaline grit, and the sharp, corrosive scent of rust from the exposed rebar and neglected equipment. Ethan hauled a bundle of rebar toward the scaffolding, each piece of ribbed steel weighing heavy on his shoulder, the familiar ache spreading through his trapezius and deltoids. His dusty work clothes were soaked dark with sweat, the fabric clinging to his back and chest like a second skin. Damp hair plastered above his brow and hid most of his face, leaving only the hard line of his jaw exposed, a jaw that had grown sharper and more angular over the years of deprivation, the softness of youth carved away by hardship and determination. Every step landed solid in the dirt, his work boots finding purchase in the shifting soil with the practiced ease of a man who had long ago learned to walk with purpose even when the ground beneath him was unreliable. When he ducked his head to wipe his face with the back of his forearm, the 2-centimeter scar above his eyebrow caught the light, a pale pink line that had faded from the angry red of its origin to something more subtle but permanent. It was a gift from the gravel that had ground into his skin while security held him in the mud 5 years ago, a permanent reminder etched into his flesh, a memento mori that he carried with him every moment of every day. "Ethan, take a break." Joe Brennan squatted on a stack of bricks, cradling a chipped enamel mug and shouting over the mechanical din. His voice had the gravelly quality of a lifelong smoker, but it carried the warmth of genuine concern. He was the shift foreman, early 50s, skin baked dark as old leather by decades of Chicago summers. Deep lines radiated from the corners of his eyes, crow's feet carved by years of squinting into the sun, laugh lines that spoke of a life lived with humor despite its hardships. He was the kind of man who had worked with his hands his entire life, who understood the dignity of labor and the quiet pride of a job done right. Ethan had been on his crew almost a year now, quiet, hardworking, never slacking, never complaining, never making excuses, and Joe respected him deeply. In a world of shortcuts and shirkers, Ethan Sterling was the real deal, and Joe recognized quality when he saw it. Ethan stacked the rebar neatly, each piece aligned with precision, and walked over. He took the mug and drank deep. The cold water cut the dust in his throat, washing away the alkaline grit, the sensation so satisfying it was almost painful. The rough edge of the enamel rim was familiar against his teeth, the texture of 1,000 such moments, of breaks taken on a dozen different sites, of the simple rituals that made a hard life bearable. "Thanks, Joe." His voice came out low, sandpapery from the work and the dust and the long hours of silence. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words were economical, stripped of ornamentation, carrying only what was necessary. Joe pulled a worn envelope from his pocket, the paper softened and creased from being carried close to the body. "I fronted you $2,000 for your mom's medical bills. Take it. Don't be proud." He thrust it forward with the gruffness of a man uncomfortable with expressions of emotion, masking his generosity behind a facade of brusqueness. Ethan's fingers paused on the envelope, feeling the weight of the cash within, the texture of the worn paper. His mother was in a long-term care unit on the outskirts of the city, a nondescript building where the paint was peeling and the equipment was outdated, but the staff was kind and the cost was manageable, barely. Dialysis and medication ate every dollar, consumed his paychecks with the voracious appetite of a predator, left him perpetually balanced on the knife edge of financial ruin. He just drained his cash to cover her hospitalization, emptying the meager savings he'd managed to accumulate. The envelope in his hand represented more than money. It represented trust, faith, the belief of a good man that Ethan was worth investing in. He didn't refuse. Refusing would have insulted Joe's generosity, would have erected a barrier where only solidarity should exist. He slipped the envelope into the inner pocket of his work vest, pressing it flat against his chest where he could feel its outline against his heart. "I'll pay you back at the end of the month," he said, and his voice carried the weight of a sacred promise. "No rush," Joe said, and meant it. Then he lowered his voice, the gruff warmth giving way to something harder, more cautious. "Listen. Frank Dalton, the Sterling Realty VP, is doing a walkthrough today. Word is he's looking for any excuse to dock our monthly performance pay. The guy's a real piece of work, came up through the business side, never spent a day on an actual site. When he shows up, don't get in his face. The guy's a bully. He looks down on everyone, especially the men who actually build his buildings. Just keep your head down and let him have his little power trip." Sterling Realty. Ethan lifted his eyes toward the site entrance, and for just a moment, something flickered in those dark pupils, something cold and ancient and patient. His eyes held no emotion, flat and cold as a frozen lake in midwinter, the kind of stillness that conceals unfathomable depths beneath. He'd been lying low on this job precisely because of Sterling's West Side project. Every morning he woke before dawn, hauled his body out of a narrow bed in a cramped rented room, and came here to carry steel and mix cement, all of it part of a plan that had been 5 years in the making. The prey was walking into his web, fat and arrogant and utterly unaware. It saved him the trouble of hunting. Less than half an hour later, a stir rippled from the front gate. The energy of the site shifted, the usual rhythm of labor disrupted by the arrival of something foreign and hostile. Frank Dalton swaggered in, belly straining the buttons of his tailored Italian suit, a man whose body had long ago declared war on his wardrobe and was winning decisively. His polished Oxfords touched the dirt like it personally offended him, each step a declaration that he belonged in boardrooms and country clubs, not among the grime and sweat of actual construction. He wore dark sunglasses that concealed his eyes, giving his face the cold, insectoid quality of a man who preferred to observe without being observed. A sneer was pasted across his face, so habitual it had etched permanent lines into his features. The smug superiority of a man who had never built anything with his own hands but took credit for everything his subordinates accomplished. For black t-shirt enforcers flanked him, ex-college athletes gone to seed, their muscles turning to fat but their capacity for casual violence undiminished. The project manager, a nervous man named Henderson who survived by appeasing whoever held the purse strings, bobbed and weaved around Dalton with a fawning smile so insincere it was almost a work of art. "Who the hell stacked this rebar?" Dalton kicked at the pile with the toe of his shoe, the gesture more performance than inspection. "It's a mess. You people know nothing about regulations? This is a lawsuit waiting to happen." He was already building his case, manufacturing grievances like a prosecutor constructing an indictment. Henderson laughed nervously, the sound like a small animal caught in a trap. "We'll get it straightened out right away, Mr. Dalton." "Absolutely. Right away. And the crew quarters are a pigsty. Trash bins overflowing. I saw a rat the size of a cat near the lunch area." Dalton waved a dismissive hand, the gesture of a king banishing an inconvenient petitioner. "I'm cutting this month's contract draw by 20%. All performance bonuses gone. Consider it a lesson in professionalism." The older laborers panicked. They'd pulled overtime for a solid month, working through the nights to hit the schedule, ignoring the protests of their aging bodies, relying on that money to feed families back home. Mortgages, car payments, children's education funds, medical bills for aging parents. All of it depended on the income that Dalton was now casually slashing with a wave of his manicured hand. The injustice of it hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. "Mr. Dalton, you can't do that." A gray-haired worker named Manny Gutierrez stepped forward, his voice cracking with desperation. His hands, gnarled and callous from 40 years of manual labor, were clasped in front of him in an unconscious gesture of supplication. "We've been working nonstop, no mistakes, hitting every milestone. My daughter starts college next month. I need that bonus. Why cut so much?" "Because I'm the client," Dalton said, looking down his nose at the older man with the particular contempt that the powerful reserve for those they consider beneath notice. Don't like it? Walk. There's a line out the gate of people who want your jobs. Younger, cheaper, less entitled. His security goon stepped up and shoved before Dalton had even finished speaking. The move was practiced, almost reflexive, the casual brutality of men who had been given permission to hurt and had grown to enjoy it. Manny, already unsteady on his feet from exhaustion and the trembling of age, stumbled backward into the brick pile. Time seemed to slow as he fell, his arms windmilling, his face registering first surprise and then pain. A sharp edge sliced his forearm open, the skin parting like wet paper. Blood spilled down his wrist and dripped onto the dirt in vivid red splashes, each drop a small explosion of color against the gray-brown monotony of the construction site. The wound was deeper than it first appeared, and the blood kept coming, a steady pulse that matched the old man's accelerating heartbeat. Manny! The crew erupted. Workers surged forward, dropping tools, abandoning positions, their faces contorted with a mixture of concern for their colleague and fury at the injustice they had just witnessed. Every man there was selling his body for a living, trading his health and years for wages that barely kept pace with inflation, already nursing a bellyful of resentment at the endless indignities of being disposable labor. Watching a coworker get injured by one of the boss's thugs, while the boss himself looked on with casual indifference, that snapped something fundamental. The site dissolved into chaos, shouting drowning out the machinery, the careful hierarchy of the job site crumbling into raw primal anger. That was when Ethan moved. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply walked through the chaos with the calm inevitability of a tide coming in, and the crowd parted before him without quite knowing why. He bent and helped Manny to his feet, his movements gentle but efficient, the practiced care of someone who had learned to tend wounds in worse conditions than this. From his pocket he pulled a clean bandage. He always carried basic medical supplies, a habit born of necessity, and pressed it firmly against the wound, his fingers finding the pressure point with unerring precision. He never looked up, never said a word. But the pressure radiating off him dropped the temperature around him by 10 degrees, and the men nearest to him fell silent, suddenly aware that something had shifted in the fundamental physics of the situation. Well, look who's trying to play hero. Dalton snorted, stepping closer to size him up with the exaggerated swagger of a man who had never been physically challenged in his life. When he recognized Ethan's face, when the features beneath the grime and sweat resolved into something familiar, he froze for 2 beats, the gears of recognition turning visibly behind his sunglasses. Then he burst into ugly laughter, the sound carrying across the suddenly quiet site. I don't believe it. The Sterling family thief. What happened? They kick you out of the family, and now you're hauling bricks on a construction site? Oh, how the mighty have fallen. From penthouse to pavement. From corner office to, what is this rebar duty? The workers stared at Ethan bewildered. Sterling. The name meant something. Sterling Realty. The company that owned this project. The family whose name was on buildings across half of Chicago. They knew him as Ethan, the quiet guy, the hard worker who never complained. Nobody guessed there was a story like this behind him. Ethan steadied the older man, making sure Manny was supported by 2 other workers before he released him. Then he turned to face Dalton fully. His expression barely flickered. His voice came out flat as deep water, each word measured and precise. Cutting wages is wrong. You injure someone, you cover the medical bills. That's not negotiation. That's basic decency. Cover medical bills? Dalton laughed like he'd heard the funniest joke in the world, the sound ringing with artificial bravado. He was performing now, aware of his audience, building a persona of dominance and power. He stepped forward, his thugs moving to flank him, and swung his palm hard at Ethan's face. The blow was telegraphed, sloppy, the work of a man who had never thrown a real punch in his life, but it carried all the weight of institutional power, the license to harm that came with his position. The slap cracked across the site, louder than it had any right to be, the sound echoing off the steel and concrete. 5 red welts bloomed on Ethan's cheek, the imprint of Dalton's fingers rising in vivid relief. A thread of blood crept from the corner of Ethan's mouth, tracing a dark line down his chin. He didn't dodge, didn't flinch, didn't raise a hand to block. The only movement was the slight turn of his head from the impact, and then the slow, deliberate return to face forward. He fixed Dalton with a gaze so cold it felt like the edge of a blade tempered by 5 years of buried rage, of patience honed to a killing edge, of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Dalton's stomach flipped for no reason he could name. For just a moment, behind the bluster and the arrogance, something primitive in his hindbrain recognized that he was in danger. "You think you're in a position to bargain?" Dalton blustered, his voice rising in pitch, the bravado suddenly hollow. A thin veneer over sudden inexplicable fear. "Stray dogs should know their place. You're nothing. Less than nothing. Get on your knees and apologize, or you're leaving here horizontal. This is my site, my rules, my..." His men closed in, cracking their knuckles, eager to demonstrate their utility. A cool female voice sliced through the mob, cutting Dalton off mid-tirade with the precision of a scalpel. "Assaulting someone in public violates Illinois assault and battery statutes. That's a Class A misdemeanor, punishable by up to a year in jail, and a fine of up to $2,500. Are you in a hurry to get booked, Mr. Dalton? Because I've got the whole thing on video, and I'm sure the Chicago PD would love to see it." Everyone turned. Serena Shaw stood in the shade of a tree near the fence, where she had been observing the confrontation with growing alarm. She was dressed in a crisp cream blazer and tailored slacks, the kind of understated elegance that cost more than most of these workers made in a month. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, revealing features that were sharp and composed, the face of a woman who had learned to navigate male-dominated spaces with intelligence and poise. She held a black leather briefcase in one hand, the kind of briefcase that contained the power to change lives with a single document, and her phone in the other, camera light still glowing bright red. She'd recorded the whole scene, from the shove to the slap to the bleeding worker and the mob of thugs closing in. Every frame was evidence. Every pixel was ammunition. She was a partner at Shaw & Associates, one of the top litigation firms in the city, a firm known for taking on impossible cases and winning them through sheer legal brilliance. She'd come to the site to finalize a compliance review for Sterling Realty, irony of ironies, and had walked right into this circus of abuse and corruption. What she had witnessed in the last 5 minutes was enough to terminate a dozen contracts and launch a dozen lawsuits. "Who the hell are you?" Dalton squinted at her, his arrogance undimmed even in the face of this new threat. "Sterling business is none of your concern. This is a private construction site and you're trespassing. Stick your nose in and I'll have you removed. And then I'll make some calls and I'll bury you right alongside him. Serena Shaw, Shaw & Associates." She stepped forward with practiced ease, holding up her bar card in one hand while keeping her phone raised with the other, still recording. "Your company was our client. Past tense. I'm now informing you that engagement is terminated, effective immediately. As for your assault on this man, either you apologize publicly and cover his medical costs, and the medical costs of the worker your thug injured, or I call the police right now and let them sort it out. And I promise you, Mr. Dalton, I will pursue this with every resource at my firm's disposal. A little lawyer thinks she can threaten me?" Dalton sneered, though a flicker of uncertainty had entered his eyes. He knew the name Shaw & Associates. Everyone in Chicago real estate knew that name. "One phone call, and I'll make sure you never practice in this city again. I know people. Judges. Politicians. You think your little firm can survive if I decide to make an example of you?" Serena's brow furrowed, ready to fire back with both legal precedent and righteous fury, but before she could speak, Ethan wiped the blood from his lip with the back of his hand. The gesture was almost casual, the motion of a man who had endured far worse and was not impressed by a simple slap. He reached into his work vest and pulled out a battered burner phone so old the keys were worn smooth, the plastic casing held together with electrical tape, the screen cracked in one corner. It matched his dust-caked work clothes perfectly, the accessory of a man who had nothing and was therefore beneath notice. He dialed a number from memory, not even looking at the keypad. The call connected almost instantly. He didn't look at anyone, his gaze resting somewhere on the rebar stacks as if he were alone with his thoughts. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but carried clearly in the stunned silence that had fallen over the site. He said 7 words, each one a stone dropped into still water. "West Side Project. Frank Dalton." Then he hung up, slid the phone back into his pocket, and leaned against the steel framework of the scaffolding. He folded his arms across his chest and stood there, a study in stillness. Waiting. Patient. Immovable. Silence stretched for several seconds, the kind of silence that feels like the held breath before a storm. Then Dalton and his crew burst into howling laughter, the sound echoing off the half-built structures. The thugs slapped their knees and pointed. Dalton clutched his belly with both hands, his face turning red with the exertion of his mirth. This is priceless. Absolutely priceless. Dalton gasped between laughs, turning to his men for validation. The broke bum is putting on a show. He's got a little phone. He made a little call. Oh, this is the best thing I've seen all year. What's your plan, Sterling? Gonna call your fellow laborers to surround me? Gonna stage a workers' revolt? Oh, please let me see it. Let me see what kind of clowns show up to rescue the great Ethan Sterling. His thugs jeered, contempt written across their faces. The workers exchanged uncertain glances, caught between hope and skepticism. They liked Ethan, respected him, but this looked odd. A laborer making a cryptic phone call and then just waiting. What could that possibly accomplish? In their experience, power didn't respond to phone calls from men like them. Power didn't even acknowledge their existence. Serena Shaw frowned, studying Ethan with the intensity of a litigator evaluating a witness. She couldn't get a read on this dust-covered man. He took a brutal hit without anger, didn't argue or retaliate or even raise his voice, made a cryptic 7-word phone call, and now just stood there waiting with the patience of a geological formation. Either he was a fool, a man broken by hardship who had retreated into delusion, or he truly had something in his back pocket, something powerful enough to make a man calm in the face of humiliation and physical assault. She found herself looking at him more closely, her professional instincts overriding her initial impression of a common laborer. The hard line of his jaw, the scar above his brow catching the light, the stillness in his eyes that wasn't vacancy but something far more controlled. A coiled tension, a banked fire. There wasn't a flicker of panic in those eyes. They were calm as deep water, and deep water Serena knew could hide anything. Time stretched, each second elongating into an eternity of uncertainty. The sun beat down. The concrete mixers continued their mechanical groaning. The wind blew dust across the silent tableau. Dalton's laughter started to fray at the edges. It was one thing to laugh at a man who reacted with anger or fear. That was familiar, that was the script. But Ethan's unshaken calm was getting under his skin like a splinter he couldn't extract. The man just stood there, arms folded, watching him with those cold, patient eyes. It was unnerving. It was wrong. Dalton spat on the ground, a gesture of contempt that felt somehow inadequate. Keep bluffing. Let's see how long you can keep that face on. When nobody shows, and nobody's going to show because nobody cares about a dirt-grubbing laborer, we'll see how tough you look then. We'll see how calm you are when my men are working you over in the parking lot. The words barely left his mouth when the screech of brakes cut through the sight noise like a knife through fabric. Everyone turned. A black Maybach, a car worth more than most of these workers would earn in a decade, pulled up hard at the gate, its tires leaving dark streaks on the pavement. The door flew open before the car had fully stopped, and Richard Harrington, CEO of Sterling Realty, half ran, half stumbled onto the site. His expensive suit was rumpled, the jacket unbuttoned and flying behind him. His tie was yanked sideways, the knot pulled halfway down his chest. His forehead gleamed with sweat, and his breath came in ragged gasps, as if he'd run a marathon rather than simply stepped out of an air-conditioned luxury vehicle. He didn't look anything like a corporate titan. He looked like a man who had just received the most terrifying phone call of his life. Every pair of eyes on that construction site snapped toward him. The project manager gaped, his jaw working soundlessly before he managed to scramble into action, intercepting the CEO with the desperate energy of a man trying to prevent a disaster. Mr. Harrington. Sir. What brings you here in person? We weren't expecting. If I'd known you were coming I would have prepared. The site conditions are, well, it's an active work zone, perhaps if you'd like to come to the office. Harrington ignored him completely, brushing past the babbling project manager as if he were invisible. His eyes swept the scene with the desperate urgency of a searchlight. The crowd of workers, the bleeding man being supported by his colleagues, the smirking security thugs, the lawyer with her phone still raised, and finally, settling on Ethan leaning against the rebar pile with his arms folded and his face unreadable. Harrington's entire body seemed to sag with a combination of relief and terror. He'd found him. Now he had to fix this. He practically sprinted over his expensive Oxfords, the same brand Dalton wore, splashing through puddles and skidding on loose gravel, in front of a crowd paralyzed with shock, a crowd that had witnessed nothing but abuse and humiliation from the Sterling family and its representatives. Richard Harrington, CEO of Sterling Realty, a man who answered only to the board of directors and the family itself, bent at the waist into a crisp 90-degree bow. The gesture was so formal, so extreme, so utterly at odds with the hierarchy of power as these workers understood it, that for a moment no one could process what they were seeing. Mr. Sterling, I am deeply sorry. I failed in my oversight. I failed in my duties. You should never have been subjected to this. There is no excuse. I take full responsibility. A gust of gritty wind swept across the site, kicking up paper scraps and dust devils. The clamor died as if someone had pulled the master power switch. Even the concrete mixers seemed to hush, their eternal grinding fading into a distant hum. Everyone stood frozen, mouths open, breaths unconsciously held, a tableau of absolute astonishment. The smug grin on Dalton's face hadn't faded. It just froze there, uglier than a grimace, a mask that no longer fit the reality of the situation. His legs started to shake, a tremor that began in his knees and worked its way up, and his face had gone the color of old newspaper. Mr. Harrington? Sir? I think there's been a mistake. You've got the wrong guy. This man, he's just a laborer, a brick hauler, he's nobody, he's... Shut your mouth. Harrington's roar was raw, animalistic, the sound of a man fighting for his professional life. His back was soaked with cold sweat, the fabric of his custom shirt clinging to his skin. Earlier that morning, Caleb Sterling himself had called, not an assistant, not a secretary, but the group chairman personally, and had torn into him with a fury that bordered on unhinged. Someone at the West Side Project had offended a man no one in the company could afford to cross, a man whose influence extended far beyond real estate, a man who could destroy not just the project but the entire Sterling group. Handle it, Caleb had screamed, or clean out your desk by end of business. Harrington had traced the threat to Dalton through a flurry of panicked phone calls and had burned rubber across town, running red lights and scattering pedestrians, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The man in front of him, the man in dusty work clothes with a fresh bruise rising on his cheek and blood still drying at the corner of his mouth, was someone even the group chairman feared. A worm like Dalton wasn't fit to lick his boots, and the worm had actually raised a hand against him. The sheer, catastrophic stupidity of it made Harrington want to weep. Harrington turned back to Ethan, his voice dropping into something deferential, almost pleading. Mr. Sterling, Dalton is fired immediately. Not just terminated, permanently blacklisted from every Sterling property, every Sterling project, every company that does business with Sterling Group. He will never work in Chicago real estate again. I'll make sure of it personally. All worker wages will be paid in full today, not next week, not at the end of the month today, plus a 1-month bonus as compensation for this disgraceful treatment. The injured worker will have all medical bills covered, rehabilitation, lost wages, everything, plus an additional $20,000 in compensation for pain and suffering. Whatever it takes. Whatever you require. Does this meet your approval? Please tell me what else I can do. Ethan lifted his eyes, his gaze passing over Dalton's bone-white face with the casual indifference of someone glancing at an insect. His voice, when he spoke, was so even it was almost surreal, the voice of a man discussing the weather, not the destruction of another man's career. Don't come back to this site looking for trouble. These people work hard. They deserve better than what you've given them. Absolutely. Absolutely. Harrington nodded so vigorously his head threatened to detach from his neck. He'll never set foot on another Sterling property. I'll have the group-wide ban circulated by end of day. Every security desk, every site supervisor, every project manager will have his photo. He's done. He's finished. He spun on his assistant, a young man who had been trailing behind him with the shell-shocked expression of someone who had just witnessed his boss lose his mind. What are you standing there for? Get finance on the line, wages and bonuses wired within the hour. I don't care if you have to drive to the bank yourself. I don't care if you have to pay them in cash out of your own pocket. Make it happen. And get this piece of garbage out of my sight. Drag him out of here. I don't want to see his face ever again. 2 site security guards, the same men who, moments ago, had been prepared to follow Dalton's orders to beat a man bloody, grabbed Dalton, whose legs had given out entirely. His face was ash-gray, his mouth working soundlessly, the word impossible, forming on his lips over and over like a prayer to a god who had abandoned him. He couldn't process it. His brain simply refused. A dirt-poor laborer in dusty work clothes, a man he had slapped and humiliated and mocked, couldn't possibly have this kind of power. It violated everything he understood about how the world worked. As Dalton's wails faded past the gate, the workers erupted into roaring cheers. The sound was primal, cathartic, the release of an entire month of tension and fear and resentment. Men who had been on the verge of violence moments before were now slapping each other on the back, laughing with disbelief, shaking their heads at the sheer improbability of what they had witnessed. We're getting paid. Full wages. And a bonus. Ethan, what the hell? You've been sitting on this the whole time? A year we've been working together, and you never thought to mention you could make CEOs bow. Who are you, man? Seriously, who are you? Joe Brennan stood there, jaw unhinged, staring at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. Nearly a year they'd worked side by side, sharing coffee and complaints and the small intimacies of manual labor. Joe had thought he knew this kid. Thought he was just a down-on-his-luck hard worker. Maybe someone with a rough past trying to rebuild. He'd never imagined this. He'd never imagined anything close to this. Serena Shaw stood off to the side, her professional composure cracking just enough to reveal the astonishment beneath. Her fingers were still tight on her briefcase strap, knuckles white. She knew Harrington, a notoriously slippery operator in Chicago real estate, a man who had built his career on navigating the treacherous waters between political power and commercial interest, always carrying himself like royalty. She'd seen him at charity galas, at industry conferences, in boardrooms where he commanded attention like a general commanding troops. She'd never seen him bow to anyone. Not to mayors, not to governors, not to the billionaires whose buildings he constructed. But here he was, bent at the waist before a man in dust-covered work clothes with a bruised face and a 2-centimeter scar above his eyebrow. This man, Ethan Sterling, was no ordinary laborer. That much was now undeniable. But if he wasn't a laborer, if he was someone powerful enough to make a CEO grovel, what was he doing here, hauling rebar and mixing cement and living in a cramped rented room? The contradiction fascinated her. The mystery pulled at her like a puzzle she couldn't resist solving. Ethan paid no attention to the probing stares, the whispered speculations, the questions hanging in the air. He picked up his hard hat from where it had fallen during the confrontation, dusted off his pants with 2 economical movements, and walked back toward the scaffolding. His back was straight and steady, his stride unchanged, as if the whole earth-shaking confrontation had barely registered. He had work to do. The rebar still needed to be stacked. The day wasn't over. And in the grand scheme of the plan he had been executing for 5 years, putting Frank Dalton in his place was barely a footnote. The sun slid westward, throwing long shadows from the rebar and steel. The construction site slowly returned to its normal rhythm, the grinding of machinery, the shouts of workers, the clang of metal on metal. But something had fundamentally changed. The men worked with a new energy now, a lightness that came from knowing that for once, the system had worked in their favor. And they kept glancing toward the scaffolding, toward the quiet man in dusty clothes, with a new expression in their eyes. Respect, yes, but also something approaching awe. By the time Ethan clocked out, the sky was soaked in orange and purple, the pollution of the city transforming the sunset into something almost beautiful. He stopped at a small grocery store on the corner of Ashland and 18th, the kind of place where the produce was slightly wilted but the prices were manageable. He picked up some millet. His mother had developed a taste for it during a brief health food phase years ago, and it was one of the few things her delicate stomach could still handle, along with a bit of lean pork and fresh greens. He selected each item with care, examining the vegetables for freshness, checking the dates on the packages. These small acts of domesticity, these rituals of care, were the anchors that kept him tethered to his humanity. A 30-minute bus ride through the changing neighborhoods of Chicago, from the industrial grit of the West Side to the tired respectability of the near suburbs, and a 10-minute walk brought him to Chicago General's long-term care wing. The building was a monument to mid-century institutional architecture, all beige brick and small windows, but it was clean and well-maintained, and the staff knew his mother by name. The hallway held the familiar antiseptic smell, that particular blend of disinfectant and medication, and the faint underlying scent of age and illness. He walked to the room at the end with the ease of long practice, his footsteps silent on the linoleum floor. His mother, Margaret, leaned against the pillows of her bed by the window. The bed was positioned to catch the last light of the day, and the fading sun painted pale gold stripes across her blankets. Her face was still pale. It was always pale now, the color of old ivory, and she was gazing outside at the distant skyline, her expression distant and contemplative. She had been beautiful once, with the kind of beauty that came from warmth and kindness rather than symmetry of features, and traces of that beauty still lingered in the shape of her eyes and the curve of her mouth. When she saw him, a smile touched her lips, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes, and she tried to sit up straighter, her thin arms pushing against the mattress with the determination of a woman who refused to be defined by her illness. "Sweetheart, you're off work?" Her voice was thin but steady, the voice of someone who had learned to conserve energy like a miser conserving coins. "Yeah." He set the groceries on the nightstand, the plastic bag crinkling softly. He moved to help her, his hands gentle and practiced as he adjusted her position and tucked a cushion behind her back. "How are you feeling today?" "Still dizzy." "Much better. The nurse, that nice young woman Maria, I think, she took my blood pressure and said everything is normal. Well, normal for me anyway." She managed a self-deprecating smile. Then her eyes caught the fading red mark on his face, the imprint of Dalton's fingers, now faded to a faint pink but still visible to a mother's searching gaze. She frowned, her hand reaching out hesitantly, hovering near his cheek but not quite touching, as if afraid of causing him more pain. "What happened to your face? Did you get into a fight?" "Ethan, promise me you're not getting into trouble." "Just clumsy. Walked into a steel beam at work." He smiled, light and easy, the lie coming with the smoothness of a stone worn by water. He picked up an apple and a paring knife from the small collection of supplies on the windowsill. "You know how those sites are. Everything's at head height when you're not paying attention. The doctor says you're recovering well. Your latest labs came back better than last month. You'll be out of here soon. I'm already looking at apartments, one with a balcony facing south so you can sit in the sun and watch the birds. There's one in Oak Park that looks promising." She sighed, guilt clouding her eyes like a shadow passing over the moon. "I'm nothing but a burden to you. Every day these hospital bills, these medications, you work so hard and it all just disappears. If only your father were still here, you wouldn't have to suffer like this. You could have a real life, career, a future. Instead, you're stuck here taking care of a sick old woman." "Mom." He cut her off gently but firmly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that brooked no argument. He handed her a plate of sliced apple, the pieces arranged in a neat spiral. "Don't go back there. The past is the past. What happened to Dad, that wasn't your fault. None of this is your fault. And everything's going to be okay. I promise you that." He stayed half an hour, the time passing in the comfortable rhythm of familiar conversation. They talked about small things, the weather, a funny story one of the nurses had told, a book she was reading. He reminded the night nurse about her schedule, discussed her medication adjustments with the attending physician, made sure everything was in order. Then he kissed her forehead and quietly stepped out, his expression shifting as soon as he was out of her sight, the mask of easy reassurance giving way to something harder, more calculating, the face of a man returning to a mission. The stairwell window was open. Evening wind carried the first hint of autumn, that particular Chicago chill that crept in around the edges of even the warmest summer days. It lifted the hem of his work shirt, cool against his skin. Ethan leaned against the sill and pulled out a second phone from his other pocket. A sleek black device, thin and pristine, its screen a perfect rectangle of polished glass. It was a phone that cost more than some people's cars, and it was utterly alien to his dust-covered clothes, his calloused hands, his life of manual labor and small economies. It was a phone that belonged to a different man entirely. He dialed from memory. The line picked up immediately. the voice at the other end steady and professional. The voice of a man who was never surprised by anything. Mr. Sterling. Lucas Grant. His chief of staff, the public-facing executor for both Abyssal Capital and Axis Laboratories. A former Navy intelligence officer with an MBA from Wharton and a mind like a steel trap, Lucas had been Ethan's first and most crucial hire. He was the one who took Ethan's visions and translated them into spreadsheets and strategies, who managed the empire while its architect worked in the shadows. Without Lucas, none of this would have been possible. What's the latest on Sterling Group? Ethan's voice was low, blending with the wind so that even if someone had been standing a few feet away, they would have heard nothing intelligible. Caleb Sterling's product launch is fully prepped, Lucas reported, his voice crisp and efficient. Dates locked for the 10th of next month. They're renting the Grand Ballroom at the Peninsula. Full media coverage, the works. They're pushing their 3rd-gen lithium manganese iron phosphate battery. Entirely your technology, sir. Just cosmetic tweaks to the casing specs and electrolyte ratios. They've changed enough to avoid the most obvious comparisons, but the core architecture is untouched. It's your work with a fresh coat of paint. He paused, and Ethan could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard in the background. Technical lead is Kyle Vance. The product is riddled with flaws. Low temperature performance and cycle life are both well below their public claims. They're faking test data to pass certification, cooking the books the same way they did 5 years ago. I've already had samples sent to an independent lab. The report will be ready next week, and it's damning. Kyle Vance. The name hit Ethan like a physical blow, though his expression didn't change. Kyle Vance, the graduate assistant he had personally mentored, whose tuition he had helped pay, whose career he had nurtured with the patience of an older brother. The man who had smiled at him across laboratory benches and called him a genius, and then had stolen his research data, his life's work, and testified against him in the court of family opinion. The betrayal still had the power to surprise Ethan, even after all these years. Not the act itself, but the depth of it. The completeness. The way Vance had not merely abandoned him but had actively worked to destroy him. Ethan's fingers tapped the cold windowsill. A single controlled movement. And Axis Labs' solid-state battery? Pilot production is complete. All parameters met or exceeded, and I mean exceeded substantially. Energy density at 500 watt-hours per kilogram, which is triple Sterling's product and nearly double the best commercial batteries currently on the market. Cycle life at 12,000 cycles with under 10% degradation. That's decades of useful life in most applications. Costs 30% below current lithium iron phosphate. And that's before we achieve economies of scale. Lucas allowed a note of satisfaction to enter his voice. The mass production line is debugged and ready. We can announce any time. The world has never seen anything like this, sir. This isn't an incremental improvement. This is a paradigm shift. Not yet. Ethan watched a flickering motion sensor light in the stairwell, the bulb struggling against the onset of evening. Let them hold their press conference. Let them make their claims. Let the world believe in their miracle battery. The higher they climb, the harder they fall. And when they fall, when their fraud is exposed and their stock craters, we'll be there to catch the pieces. He shifted his weight, his voice dropping even lower. What about the Aegis Cup? All set. Your anonymous handle Yen is registered and verified. This year's target, as you know, is Sterling Group's newly upgraded Enterprise Core Firewall, the one they've been marketing as military-grade and unbreakable. They've been using it as a selling point for their new corporate clients. The prize pool is $1 million. Competition kicks off at 8 p.m. the day after tomorrow. The hacker community is already buzzing. This is the most anticipated Aegis Cup in years. Got it. Ethan ended the call, pocketed the phone and leaned back against the wall, staring at the fluorescent lights overhead. They hummed with the particular frequency of institutional lighting, a sound he had come to associate with hospitals and police stations and all the other places where power was exercised over the powerless. 5 years. Over 1,800 days and nights. Days spent hauling steel and concrete, feeling his body toughen and scar. Nights spent in a cramped rented room. The glow of a computer screen his only light, building the empire that would destroy his enemies. He'd fallen from the sky into the mud, taking his sick mother to a rented room in a rundown neighborhood, hauling rebar and mixing cement before sunrise, becoming invisible dust. The Sterlings all thought he was broken. A shattered man who would spend the rest of his life in obscurity, drinking himself to death or simply fading away. They had stopped thinking about him years ago. If they'd ever thought about him at all beyond the satisfaction of having destroyed him, they didn't know. They didn't know that in those 5 years, using a seed fund his father had hidden away in a blind trust they had never discovered, he'd coded and experimented in that tiny rental. Axis Laboratories had quietly reached the global summit in artificial intelligence and next-gen energy, filing patents through shell companies and academic collaborators, building a reputation in the scientific community, while remaining invisible to the business world. Abyssal Capital, built on investments so eerily precise they seemed like prophecy, had amassed a fortune in the hundreds of billions, betting on market movements with an accuracy that had made competitors whisper about insider trading, when the truth was simply that Ethan Sterling could read data like other men read newspapers. He'd been granted special consultant status with the Department of Homeland Security after methodically exposing 3 national-level zero-day exploits that had been lurking in critical infrastructure systems, and his security clearances were higher than those of most elected officials. He hadn't been surviving. He hadn't been enduring. He had been weaving a net of such complexity and reach that when it finally closed, nothing and no one would escape. Caleb stole his technology. He'd crush him with something generations ahead, something that would make Caleb's stolen work look like the obsolete scrap it was. The family grabbed his father's legacy. He'd dismantle their empire piece by piece until they begged him to take it back. Every lie, every slander, every moment of humiliation, he would wash it all clean in public under the brightest lights with the whole world watching. The stairwell light clicked off, plunging him into darkness. In the dark, Ethan's eyes burned bright, the reflected glow of distant city lights giving them an almost feral quality. He straightened, brushed off his clothes with 2 quick motions, and descended the stairs. Steady steps, each one solid and deliberate. The road was long, and the real show was just beginning. A week later, the Global New Energy Summit opened at McCormick Place in Chicago. The massive convention center, with its soaring glass walls and modernist architecture, had been transformed into a temple of innovation. The industry's heaviest players filled the exhibition halls: CEOs and chief scientists, venture capitalists and government officials, journalists and analysts, all moving through the space in a constant, purposeful flow. Tailored suits and silk ties, name badges hanging from lanyards, the low hum of deal-making and networking that characterized these gatherings of the powerful. The air itself seemed charged with the electricity of ambition. Professor Arthur Pendleton, a titan in the field of materials science whose work had laid the foundation for half the battery technologies currently on the market, had mobility issues that confined him to a wheelchair these days. He had been a close friend of Ethan's father, one of the few who had stood by David Sterling when the rest of the family had turned against him. Pendleton had asked Ethan to deliver some summit documents on his behalf, and had in fact been quietly helping Ethan for years, safeguarding critical evidence, providing access to laboratories and testing facilities, serving as a secret mentor and ally in a world where Ethan had few of either. Ethan arrived in a faded light blue t-shirt and jeans, a manila envelope tucked under his arm. His clothes were clean but worn, the jeans frayed at the cuffs, the t-shirt soft from 1,000 washings. He looked like a graduate student, perhaps, or a junior lab assistant, certainly nothing like the industry titans who filled the halls around him. At the main entrance, beneath the soaring arch of the convention center's facade, a security guard in a crisp uniform blocked his path. "What's your business?" The guard sized him up with open disdain, his eyes traveling from Ethan's scuffed shoes to his unstyled hair and back again. "This is an industry summit. Invitation only. No loitering, no panhandling, no soliciting. Laborers and delivery personnel use the rear loading dock. That way." He pointed with exaggerated patience, the gesture of a man explaining something simple to someone slow. Before Ethan could answer, before he could decide whether to explain himself or simply find another entrance, footsteps and laughter approached from behind. The sound was unmistakable, the confident, casual noise of people who belonged. Caleb Sterling swept up in a bespoke charcoal suit that probably cost more than Ethan's entire annual salary as a laborer. His dark hair was immaculate, every strand in its designated place. A Patek Philippe glinted on his wrist, a watch that cost as much as a luxury car. and a glamorous woman hung on his arm with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being looked at. Her dress was red, her heels were high, and her smile was the particular smile of someone who had chosen her companion for his wealth and status rather than his character. Caleb spotted Ethan instantly. His eyes narrowed with the recognition of a predator identifying familiar prey, then lit with cruel amusement. This was an opportunity too good to pass up. An audience, a stage, and his fallen cousin standing at the gate like a supplicant at the temple doors. Well, if it isn't Ethan Sterling. Caleb raised his voice for the benefit of the gathered attendees, the sound carrying across the entrance hall with the practiced projection of a man accustomed to commanding attention. What are you doing here? Construction site not keeping you busy enough? Figured you'd sneak in for free food and open bars? I hear they have excellent canapes at the networking receptions. People paused in their conversations, turning to stare with the prurient interest of bystanders witnessing a public confrontation. Their expressions were curious and dismissive. They recognized Caleb Sterling, the young heir apparent of Sterling Group, and they were intrigued to see him confront this shabby stranger. Caleb warmed to his audience, his voice taking on the cadence of a performer. For those who don't know, and I realize this is a rather embarrassing chapter of family history, this is my cousin Ethan Sterling. The black sheep. Stole core company technology right out of our R&D labs, embezzled millions in research funds to feed his gambling addiction, got kicked out by our grandfather 5 years ago. It was quite the scandal at the time. And look at him now, showing up at a professional summit dressed like that, trying to get past security. It's almost sad, isn't it? A few low snickers rippled through the crowd. The lies were so smooth, so confidently delivered, that no one thought to question them. This was a Sterling, after all, speaking about family business. Why would he lie? The guard, emboldened by this confirmation of his instincts, moved to shove Ethan's shoulder. Move along. You heard Mr. Sterling. Don't make trouble for our legitimate guests, or I'll have you removed from the premises. Stop. The word cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade. Serena Shaw stepped from a side corridor, having just finished registering at the VIP desk. She was dressed in a sharp black suit with a gleaming speaker's badge pinned to her lapel, her presence commanding immediate attention. She fixed the guard with a cold stare that had made opposing counsel wilt in courtrooms across the country. This man is delivering documents to Professor Arthur Pendleton, who is a keynote speaker at this summit and a member of the National Academy of Engineering. Which part of the summit's security protocols authorizes you to eject someone on a legitimate errand from the main entrance? Because I've reviewed those protocols extensively, and I don't recall the section that says harass anyone who doesn't look wealthy enough. Ms. Shaw. Caleb arched an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. Serena Shaw was a rising star in Chicago's legal community, and her presence here was not unexpected. Her firm handled compliance for half the companies in the energy sector. Why are you defending this guy? I just told you he's a convicted thief, his reputation is toxic. If I were you, I'd be very careful about the company I keep. It might reflect poorly on your firm. Mr. Sterling. Serena turned to him, her tone crisp and professional, but with an edge that could cut glass. First, I'm not aware of any conviction. I checked because I'm thorough. What I found was a lot of accusations and a very convenient lack of due process. So calling him a thief in public in front of witnesses and media is defamation per se, and you can be held liable for damages. I'd be happy to explain the relevant case law if you have a few hours. Second, whom I assist is my business, not yours. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have documents to deliver. Caleb's face darkened, the mask of amused superiority slipping to reveal the ugliness beneath. Before he could retort, before he could marshal his resources for a counterattack, an organizer's voice crackled over the PA system, summoning him for his keynote address. He was the star of the show, and the show must go on. He shot Ethan a venomous glare, leaned in close enough that only Ethan could hear him whisper, "This isn't over, you piece of trash," then straightened his collar, pasted his public smile back on, and strode inside with his date, the crowd parting before him. The guard hesitated, looking from Serena's bar card to Ethan's calm face and back again. His instincts told him to defer to power, and Serena Shaw radiated power in a way that transcended her designer suit. "He's with me," she repeated. "Any further questions, or can we proceed?" The guard stepped aside. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying genuine gratitude. "That's twice now you've stepped in. Don't mention it." She lowered her voice as they entered the main hall, the noise of the summit washing over them. "Caleb Sterling is a snake, and I've been looking for a reason to terminate my firm's relationship with his company. Today gave me two. Just keep your head down in there, deliver your documents, and leave. He's petty and vindictive, and he's got a lot of resources. Don't give him another chance to make a scene." Ethan nodded, offering no explanation for why he was here, who he really was, or what he intended to do. He followed her into the main hall, his manila envelope still tucked under his arm, his expression placid and unreadable. The main hall was packed to capacity. On stage, a giant screen blazed with Sterling Group's promotional material, sleek graphics, soaring music, images of a greener future powered by Sterling's revolutionary new battery. Caleb stood at the podium, radiating the confidence of a man who believed his own press releases. "And so I'm proud to announce that our battery represents a global leap forward. 40% energy density increase over the previous generation, uncompromising safety protocols, cycle life exceeding 5,000 cycles. That's years of reliable performance. Full mass production begins next month, and we will lead the revolution in energy storage. This isn't just a product launch, ladies and gentlemen. This is the beginning of a new era." Applause rolled through the room. Executives leaned forward in their seats, their interest genuine and their skepticism suspended. If what Caleb was claiming was true, Sterling Group was about to dominate the market. Ethan stood at the very back against the wall, manila envelope still in hand. He listened to Caleb hawk his own stolen, embellished research, each lie piling on top of the last like layers of sediment. His expression remained unchanged, but deep in his eyes, something cold and patient kept watch. He was watching a clumsy performance, a con man selling snake oil to an audience that wanted to believe. The keynote ended to enthusiastic applause. The Q&A session opened, and a financial journalist near the front raised her hand. She identified herself as being from Bloomberg, and her question was direct. "Mr. Sterling, can you address the battery's low-temperature performance? Our readers in the northern states, and frankly in Canada and Scandinavia, where we have significant readership, are very concerned about winter range loss. Electric vehicles in Chicago winters don't have the best track record." Caleb smiled, waving a dismissive hand with the confidence of a magician who knows his trick is undetectable. "Not an issue. Our battery delivers over 90% capacity retention at -20 Celsius. That's been independently verified. It handles northern winters with ease, better than any battery currently on the market. Next question." The lie was so brazen, so confident, that the journalist nodded and sat down. But before the next question could be asked, a flat voice rose from the back of the hall. Unamplified, it somehow sliced through the ambient noise and the rustling of the crowd with the clarity of a bell. 90%? Would you care to present your raw low-temperature test data in front of this audience? The full data set, not the selected highlights. The methodology, the sample size, the statistical significance. Let's see the science. Every head turned. A sea of faces swiveled toward the back corner. Ethan walked forward, his manila envelope still in hand. His faded t-shirt and worn jeans were a stark contrast to the sea of suits around him, and for a moment, the sheer incongruity of his appearance held the room in suspension. Who was this man? What was he doing here? And how had he managed to ask the one question that every technical person in the room had been thinking? Caleb's face lost color, the blood draining from his cheeks as if a plug had been pulled. "Ethan," he barked, his composure cracking. "Enough. You're a construction labor. What do you know about battery technology? This is a professional summit, not a personal vendetta. Security. Get him out of here." "What I know about battery technology," Ethan said, accepting a microphone from a startled audio tech who had rushed to provide one. "You understand better than anyone. Because you didn't develop this battery. I did. And the version you're presenting has 3 fatal flaws that make it dangerous to consumers and fraudulent to investors." He raised his voice slightly, projecting to the far corners of the hall. "First, low-temperature fraud. You're using conventional carbonate electrolytes. The SEI layer, The solid electrolyte interface that forms on the anode begins lithium plating at -10 Celsius. At -20, real-world capacity retention doesn't even hit 65%. Your 90% claim comes from lab condition tests on cherry-picked samples that bear no relation to mass production. I know because I designed the original experiments, and I know exactly how you've manipulated the data. Second, cycle life inflation. Your cathode manganese doping ratio is off by 2 percentage points. That might not sound like much, but in battery chemistry, it's the difference between a product that works and a product that fails. The manganese dissolution problem was one I was working on solving when you stole my research. It's still unaddressed. After 2,000 cycles, capacity fade exceeds 20%. You won't reach 5,000 cycles. In a typical passenger vehicle, range will have within 3 years of normal use. Third, and most critically, thermal instability. You thin the separator to chase energy density. A decision so reckless it borders on criminal negligence. At 150 Celsius nail penetration, the cell goes into thermal runaway. It catches fire. It explodes. It doesn't meet federal safety standards, and you know it. The units you sent for certification had specially thickened separators, nothing like the production cells you're planning to ship to consumers. You're not just committing fraud. You're endangering lives. His delivery was unhurried, the technical specifics rolling off his tongue with the precision of someone who had lived and breathed this technology. Every point landed squarely on critical battery engineering vulnerabilities, and the room recognized the ring of authenticity. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't competitor sabotage. This was the voice of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. The room went deathly silent. The audience of experts, engineers, supply chain managers, research directors, investors, recognized the truth when they heard it. No one without deep access to the core technology could articulate these parameters so accurately. "Who is this guy?" someone whispered. "He knows more about Sterling's battery than Sterling does. Every point is surgically precise," an engineer from a competing firm muttered to her colleague. "If he's right, and I think he is, Sterling is looking at a class action lawsuit that will bankrupt them." The murmur swelled into a tide. Caleb's face had gone waxen, his knuckles white where he gripped the podium. "He's lying. He's a disgruntled former employee. He's here to sabotage us. I demand that security remove this man immediately. Professor Pendleton knows whether I'm lying." Ethan's words fell into the chaos like a stone into water, and the ripples spread outward. The side doors of the hall swung open. 2 aides wheeled in Professor Arthur Pendleton, silver-haired and sharp-eyed despite his wheelchair, a man whose name appeared in every textbook on materials science published in the last 30 years. He held a thick inspection report bound in a blue cover, and his expression was that of a hanging judge about to deliver a verdict. Pendleton was a titan, a living legend. When he entered a room, people stopped talking and listened. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pendleton said, his voice carrying the authority of a lifetime at the pinnacle of his field. "Every single word this young man just spoke is true. I have here a certified report from the nation's leading independent testing laboratory. All 3 defects he identified are confirmed. Sterling Group's battery is a fraud, a dangerous one. They have falsified their data, misled their investors, and placed consumers at risk." He gestured, and the report was projected onto the main screen. Detailed test figures, degradation curves, thermal runaway footage captured by high-speed cameras, all of it stamped with the laboratory's official seal. The evidence was irrefutable, overwhelming, damning beyond any possibility of spin. Camera flashes erupted like a lightning storm. Reporters surged forward, microphones thrust toward Caleb like weapons. "Mr. Sterling, is Professor Pendleton correct? Have you been knowingly shipping dangerous batteries? What do you say to the investors in this room who were considering partnerships with your company? How long have you known about these defects? Were you planning to disclose them before the product went to market?" Caleb staggered backward, his suit crumpling, his face cycling through white and red. His mouth opened and closed, but no words emerged. He tried to form a defense, to summon the lies that had always served him before, but against the crushing weight of Pendleton's reputation and the laboratory's evidence, no defense existed. He broke. In full view of the entire industry, Caleb Sterling turned and fled, shielded by his security detail, disappearing through a rear exit like a coward retreating from a battlefield. The hall erupted into chaos. Reporters chased after him, camera crews knocked over chairs, and the assembled executives and scientists erupted into urgent conversations. Everyone was asking the same question. Who was the young man who had exposed it all? The man in the faded t-shirt who knew more about battery chemistry than the company's entire technical team? Serena Shaw stood motionless near the front of the hall, watching Ethan's retreating back as he slipped out a side door. A seismic realization was settling into her bones. A construction laborer. A man who hauled rebar for minimum wage. He had just dissected advanced battery chemistry more precisely than most technical directors she had ever deposed. He had cited specific measurements, specific chemical processes, specific failure modes. And he had done it with the calm assurance of someone who wasn't guessing, someone who knew because he had been there at the creation. What exactly was he? Ethan handed the manila envelope to Professor Pendleton, who accepted it with a nod of grim satisfaction. Thank you, Ethan. Your father would be proud. Now go, the vultures are circling, and you don't need to be here when they start asking questions you're not ready to answer. Ethan murmured a quiet acknowledgement, squeezed the old man's shoulder, and slipped out a side door before the press could swarm him. He moved through the service corridors of McCormick Place with the ease of someone who had studied the floor plans, emerging into the golden afternoon light without attracting attention. By the time the autumn sun gilded the sycamores that lined the streets of his neighborhood, Ethan was back in his tiny rented room on the south side. The contrast between the gleaming convention center and this cramped space could not have been more stark. The room was barely 150 square feet, a single bed with a thin mattress, an old wooden desk scarred by the work of previous tenants, stacks of technical textbooks and electronic components piled against the water-stained walls. The wall itself was papered with circuit diagrams and equations, a palimpsest of genius written in marker and pen, layer upon layer of calculations and designs. On the desk sat a modified laptop, its exterior plain and unremarkable, the kind of machine you could buy at any electronics store. But its internal specifications, the processors, the memory, the custom-built components, dwarfed top-tier workstations, a hidden supercomputer disguised as budget hardware. He washed his face in the tiny bathroom sink, the cold water shocking against his skin. He changed out of his work shirt and into a clean black t-shirt. Then he sat down at his desk, flexed his fingers once, and logged into the Aegis Cup portal. The Aegis Cup was the most elite hacking competition on the planet, the Olympics of cybersecurity, the Super Bowl of digital warfare. Every year, the organizers selected a top-tier corporate firewall as the target, a system that had never been breached, a fortress of code that represented the state-of-the-art in digital defense. The first competitor to comprehensively breach it took home $1 million and eternal glory in the hacker community. This year's target was Sterling Group's impregnable enterprise core firewall, the same system they had spent millions upgrading with a top European security firm, the same system they had been marketing as proof of their technological sophistication. 8 p.m. Chicago time. The competition went live. Tens of thousands of elite hackers from around the world attacked simultaneously. State-sponsored operatives from China and Russia, independent contractors from Eastern Europe, prodigies in dorm rooms, veterans in basements, the entire distributed ecosystem of the world's best digital infiltrators. The official live stream drew hundreds of thousands of viewers, the chat scrolling at blur speed. A cascade of technical jargon and trash talk and escalating excitement. 10 minutes in, nobody's cracked the first layer. Sterling's firewall is legit. I'll give them that much. Millions of dollars of upgrades. This isn't some corporate IT hobby project. It'll take hours minimum. Even Night Owl, last year's champ, the guy who breached the Pentagon's test system, is stuck. Gonna be a long night. Settle in, folks. Ethan's fingers touched the keyboard. His pace wasn't frantic, wasn't rushed. It was surgical, each keystroke deliberate, each command precisely calibrated. Code scrolled in black waterfalls across his screen, lines of text reflecting in his dark eyes. He traced the firewall's logic like a cartographer redrawing a map he had once drawn himself, finding the familiar landmarks beneath the surface renovations. Kyle Vance had stolen the surface application code, the visible architecture, the user-facing systems. But the underlying security architecture, the deep structure, the foundational logic? That was Ethan's original work, written in long nights of obsessive focus, and he had never shared it with anyone. Not with Vance, not with the company, not with a single living soul. Sterling's firewall was still built on his foundational framework. They had simply hired European security consultants to reskin it, to add layers of complexity that obscured the essential structure without changing it. Breaking his own work was effortless. It was like solving a puzzle he had designed himself, navigating a maze he had constructed. Every security measure, every failsafe, every encrypted pathway, he knew them all because he had created them all. 9 minutes, 47 seconds. On the live stream's main display, the green defense active marker that had held steady since the competition began suddenly flickered. Once, twice. And then flipped to a pulsing, urgent red. A single line of text blazed across the screen, simple and devastating. Breached attacker ID. The entire stream froze for 3 heartbeats, the servers struggling to process the tsunami of reactions. Then the chat detonated. Holy! Flooded the screen so fast the platform itself lagged, the scrolling text becoming an illegible blur of shock and awe. 10 minutes? 9 minutes and change. That's not possible. What kind of god-tier hacker is this? Last year's champ took 3 hours. The year before took 5. Yen? I've never heard that handle before. Is this someone new? Someone who's been hiding in the shadows? Sterling bragged for 6 months about being unbreakable. 6 months. Wiped out in under 10 minutes. Their credibility is ash. Their stock is going to crater. The judges' table dissolved into chaos. Technical experts from 3 continents huddled together, frantically verifying the logs, checking the breach path, confirming that this was real and not a glitch in the system. They traced the attacker's path through the firewall's defenses and came up shaking their heads in disbelief. The breach was elegant. Not brute force, not exploitation of a known vulnerability, but a surgical dissection of the firewall's core logic. Whoever Yen was, they hadn't just broken the firewall. They had understood it better than its creators. The head judge, a renowned cybersecurity expert from MIT, leaned into his microphone. His voice was shaking slightly. Ladies and gentlemen, we have confirmed the breach. It is valid. Competitor Yen, total time 9 minutes and 47 seconds, has shattered the all-time Aegis Cup record. A record that has stood for 7 years, and wins the global championship. We are witnessing history tonight. The global hacker community erupted. Within minutes, #AegisCup #Yen was trending in 7 countries. The mysterious champion who had emerged from nowhere to destroy an unbreakable firewall, in less than 10 minutes became an instant legend. At Sterling Group headquarters, in the gleaming tower that bore the family name, klaxons screamed through the tech division. Red alerts flashed on every monitor. Kyle Vance, now Chief Technology Officer by virtue of his betrayal, stared at the intrusion alert on his screen, and all the blood drained from his face. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably. The core firewall was completely compromised. Not just a surface poke, not just a denial of service attack, but a full comprehensive penetration. Every piece of sensitive data lay exposed before the intruder like a body on an autopsy table. Patent files, financial records, internal emails, executive chat logs, the private communications of the Sterling family itself, all of it naked and vulnerable. Trace it. Vance shrieked, his voice cracking. Trace the IP now. Throw every resource we have at this. I want to know who did this within the hour. A dozen engineers scrambled, keyboards clattering in a frenzy of desperate activity. They chased ghost trails through dozens of countries, proxy chains layered into an impenetrable maze, false leads and dead ends at every turn. They traced the signal to a server in Estonia, that bounced to a server in Brazil that routed through 17 intermediate nodes before vanishing into the digital ether. They never even glimpsed the true source. And in the deepest directory of the core database, the most secure location in the entire Sterling digital infrastructure, they found something that made their blood run cold. A single character, carved into the system like a signature on a masterpiece. Yen. It was a declaration. A warning. The mocking brand of a conqueror seared into Sterling's digital heart. Vance slumped into his chair, cold sweat soaking through his shirt. His mind raced through the possibilities. Competitors, foreign governments, activist hackers, but one possibility kept rising to the surface like a body that wouldn't stay submerged. A gut-deep certainty coiled in his chest, cold and implacable. The man from 5 years ago, the man whose work he had stolen, whose life he had helped destroy, was back. And he was no longer hiding. In his rented room, Ethan had already closed the competition interface. The $1 million prize meant nothing to him. He routed it anonymously to his mother's hospital within seconds, earmarked for patients who couldn't afford care. A gesture of quiet generosity that no one would ever trace back to him. Then he opened the files he had downloaded from Sterling's core systems during those 9 minutes and 47 seconds. Internal emails between Victor and Caleb Sterling, dating back years, detailing the conspiracy to steal his research. Detailed records of the patent theft, who had been paid, who had been threatened, who had looked the other way. The fabricated embezzlement evidence, complete with the original, unaltered documents that proved his innocence. Bribes to witnesses and officials, recorded in spreadsheets and payment confirmations. Screenshots of conversations in which the Sterlings laughed about his father's death, joked about his mother's illness, planned their next moves against anyone who threatened their power. Every piece of dirt, perfectly preserved. Every crime, meticulously documented by the criminals themselves, preserved in their own systems because they had never imagined anyone could breach their defenses. They had built their fortress, and in doing so, they had created the perfect repository of evidence against themselves. Ethan downloaded everything into an encrypted solid-state drive. His fingertip tapped the desktop once, twice, a slow rhythm like a heartbeat. Then, for the first time in a very long while, the faintest cold smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. Time to accelerate the harvest.